Tonight on Horizon, it's been 10 years since our world changed, since the unimaginable became shockingly real. How the 9/11 attacks changed us as a state and a nation. Next on Horizon.
Horizon is made possible by contributions from the Friends of Eight, members of your Arizona PBS station. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to Horizon. I'm Ted Simons. There's no doubt that 9/11 changed us in many different ways. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the attacks. Children were left without parents, spouses without better halves. Hundreds of emergency responders became victims, and thousands more military personnel have died fighting the war against terrorism. When the Twin Towers collapsed, America's sense of invulnerability went with them. But the American spirit remains strong. We came together as a nation to fight a common enemy and showed the world we wouldn't be victims for long. Joining me to share their views on how 9/11 changed us is Dr. Deborah Hall, a social psychologist at Arizona State University, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, Arizona Republic columnist Rob, and Republic columnist Ed Montini. Good to have you all here. Thank you so much for joining us on a special edition of Horizon. And I wanted to get kind of a conversation and discussion going on a variety of aspects. But let's start with not where were you when 9/11 happened. What were your initial thoughts after you realized what 9/11 really was?
Okay. And to sort of situate you guys as to sort of my thought processes after that sort of tragedy sunk in. I was actually a senior in college in 2001, and up until that point I'd had a fairly sheltered upbringing. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had this sort of naive and simplistic perspective on the world, that there were good people and that there were probably some bad people out there. Good people did good things, bad people did bad things, and that was kind of it. They had good or bad motives. And I think once the reality of 9/11 sunk in, I think it prompted not a sudden shift, sort of an overnight change in my thinking of how the world worked and what the nature of human existence is, but it definitely led to a gradual change and a more complex understanding of good and evil and the actions that people take. And I think the most sort of from the standpoint of 10 years down the road and a whole lot of graduate training and a lot of research behind me now is that that there is no sort of black and white in terms of understanding why people do things, why people commit acts of extreme violence and terrorism. Many of the basic fundamental motives that drive people to do acts like this that have horrible impact and are seemingly hateful and very negative and evil actually come from some of the same motives that help us govern our day-to-day lives, from basic categorization, cognitive processes, to just belonging in social groups. And so I think it's a more complex understanding that sort of emerged after 9/11 for me.
Dr. Jasser, your initial thoughts, not what had happened, but after you knew what happened.
Well, I had come to Phoenix in '99 to join my father in private practice, and when I heard what happened and figured out that it was an attack on our country, sort of not only the physician in me kicked in, but the military officer kicked in. And I had served 11 years and left as a lieutenant commander, and realized that my gut was I wanted to join up again and figure out who did this and find them and make them pay for attacking our country. I was concerned about what was happening next. We heard about the Pentagon, about the World Trade Center, about the crash in Pennsylvania, and I didn't know if there was more that was going to happen. You sort of didn't know when the attack was going to stop. And you get into this why are they attacking us mentality, and you want to find out who did it. And later, as I found out it was Muslims, I rededicated my life to reforming the ideas that created these monsters.
Interesting. Rob, just the idea of, wow, this is really what happened. What hit you?
I was aware enough of Osama bin Laden that from the time the second tower was hit, I assumed it was a terrorist attack by him and his organization. And I had the task of sitting at home watching the news, but writing a column for the next day's newspaper in reaction to it. And as I recall, I made two basic points. The first was that this was an act of war by a dedicated enemy, and we needed to understand that and respond accordingly. And the second point was that even though we needed to do that, we also needed over time to reassess the extent to which we tried to micromanage the geopolitics of the Middle East, both because we were very bad at it, but also because it made us even more of a target than our innate ideas and philosophies made us to this enemy in any event.
Ed, initial thoughts?
My initial thoughts were more pragmatic. You know, as you would know, the first thing I heard from an editor, and right off the bat, the idea was get some stuff together, drive down to the airport, get on the first plane to go to New York. I get some stuff together, I get in the car, I'm driving down to the airport, and they say the airport is closed. And then I knew, really for the first time, okay, the world is different. It's really different now. And then it said all airports are closed. And then you're thinking, okay, now the world is really, really different. And that was, to me, the realization where it slipped from being a news story into this sense of this isn't just something I'm going to cover. This is the way the world's going to be from now on.
Indeed, anyone living anywhere near a flight path was amazed in those days after 9/11. The skies were very, very quiet. What did you hear from people? We got your initial thoughts when you realized what happened. What were you hearing?
Well, hearing and observing, the thing that stands out for me is the way in which Americans really came together in a very positive way. So it seemed that from September 11th and September 12th on, we were talking about, we had a very strong sense of we as Americans, a strong sense of patriotism and pride that really served, I think, served an important sort of healing function. It was a way of dealing with a collective threat in a collective type of coping mechanism. So the thing that I remember sort of hearing the most about that is just, a lot of bitter, angry, sort of vengeful words against, sort of trying to figure out who did this and how to sort of get back at them and protect ourselves, but also a lot of positive sentiment about sort of coming together as Americans, as New Yorkers, as United States citizens, and as people, we saw a lot of support coming from other countries abroad, too.
What did you hear from others?
Well, I think it's interesting. We got calls initially. We had a Children of Abraham discussion group that immediately we were calling each other. People were worried about whether there was going to be any lashing out against Muslims, and our community really came together unbelievably. You can't forget the fact that there was a gentleman from the Sikh community that was killed as a result of a hate crime in our community in Phoenix. So as Muslims, we had a double introspection, if you will, not only as Americans coming together, but as Muslims realizing that why is this happening? And many of our families left the Middle East to escape this type of radicalism, and yet it followed us here, and we had to deal with it.
I don't want to get too far afield here, but back to you and what you heard, because a lot of people at that time were very critical, obviously, of Islam and the Muslims, and why aren't they doing this and why aren't they doing that? Were you hearing a lot of that, and were you understanding that anger, or was that, what were you hearing and how were you responding to that?
Initially, actually, Americans, I think, are generally, there wasn't as much of a reflexive, the general response was less reflexively xenophobic, if you will. But I think over time, the negative opinions about Islam have actually incrementally increased. They've gone from 33% on 9/10/11 to 49, 48% in some polls, now negative opinions about Islam. So I would attribute that to the fact that Muslims as a community have not shown that they've condemned terrorism, but they haven't led the fight against the ideology and been outspokenly moving against these things. So, I think that there was a lot of muffled response. There was, a lot of times natural response to fear is just to be quiet. And over time, as we discuss this, one of the things in the 10 years review that I'm doing now is to see that we really haven't functionally discussed religion in the community. We've been into either interfaith kumbaya, which is just blind positivity, or very negative, where Islam is the problem, Muslims are the problem, and you leave no room for solution. Somewhere the answer is in between, where there's aspects that need reform, Muslims that need to take responsibility, and knock off a lot of the victimology that has obsessed some of our community.
Friends, family, coworkers, what were you hearing?
I had a very poignant conversation with my eldest son, which has long stuck with me. He was a student at ASU, and he called me in the morning when it occurred. and asked me what I thought happened. And I said, well, I don't know for sure, but I think it's Osama bin Laden, and explained to him a little bit about who that was and what he represented. And then my son asked me, do you think they will reinstate the draft? And that took me back, made me realize the way that this might look to his generation. And I told him without a lot of prescience that I didn't think that this was the kind of fight that would require large land armies needing lots of men. But I did tell him accurately that the last thing the military wants to deal with is draftees. So I was able to reassure him on that score, but it always stuck with me, that particular conversation.
Interesting. Ed, what were you hearing? Friends, families?
Well, actually, one of the interesting things, I was coaching a Little League team at the time. My boy was playing Little League, and we were playing Little League. And we drew, I usually draw, I try to get my Little League team to be the Pirates because I'm from Pittsburgh originally, but I didn't get to draw this year, so that year, and our team was the A's. And one of the boys on my team said, can we switch our name to the USA's? And so we wrote on everybody's hat, we wrote USA's, and it was that way all through that season. And it was one of those positive things that has since pretty much gone away, but it was a very cool thing for that time.
Let's stick with that. What happened to because you mentioned the unifying element and the hand holding and everyone's an American, all for one and one for all. What happened to that?
Time, I think. And once time goes away, once we're all less afraid, once we're start settling in our ways, once you get back to I actually think we're much more divisive now than we were before 9/11, and I think that it probably did have some impact on that.
I think it's beyond just time. I think ultimately, if you look, I testified at the counter-radicalization hearings that Congressman King had earlier this year, and I found that it was almost as if my testimony was labeled more as conservative or was it liberal, and that the questions I was being asked, it's almost as if everything in the United States seems to, after you get past the attack, within a few days we started to get to the division of everything being partisan. So everything revolves around the axis of partisanship, and we don't get to find out which things do we share, do we have a common goal, a common vision, and I think we haven't found any way to articulate what we're fighting, because it's always, how do we, and as a Muslim I'll tell you, I find that our community is often used as a ping pong ball between the far right and the far left, that one side says we're all about minorities, the other side says we're all about killing the enemy, and you don't get to a solution that I think we all share, and it's all because of the axis of partisanship.
The idea, a family suffers a crisis and everyone gathers around, but a lot of times that family will split in certain ways that no one can foresee later. Is that what happened to America after 9/11?
That's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure. I don't know if I honestly believe that where we are right now is a direct. I mean, it's hard to imagine where we'd be as a country and the state of our government and just society where we would be if 9/11 didn't happen. But I think that events like 9/11 that are utterly life-changing and sort of threatening in the sense that they remind us all that we're just mortals, that we have an expiration date, and that might not come, when we're expecting it, and it might not come when we're ready for it. It might come sooner than that. Actually leads to shifts. I think there's a lot of social psychological research to suggest that it leads to shifts in our worldviews, and that threatening sort of sense of helplessness leads us to sort of reaffirm our morals and our beliefs and our values in a way that I think in the short term manifested itself in sort of a coming together, but in the long term may have actually had more of an impact where people are sort of sticking to their core values in a way that conflicting values sort of pose a little bit more of a threat.
I think it was sort of inevitable. The initial reaction was to go after the people who did this. And about that, there could be unanimity. Once you've done that, and there was only a couple of votes against doing that in the U.S. Congress. It's the use of force authorization to do that. But then when you go to the larger question of how do we on a continuing basis protect ourselves as best we can against this kind of terrorist attack, you move into an awful lot of complicated, difficult, and controversial issues about which unanimity is a impossible goal. It's just things we are going to disagree on. There's nothing more important, so the disagreements are going to be pretty vocal and strongly felt.
And that idea of patriotism that we felt early on became partisanship. It was like, if you disagree with me, you're unpatriotic. If you don't think we should spend all this money to do this, if you have some disagreement, that's because you're unpatriotic somehow, as opposed to just you think that maybe that's not the right way to fund something. The way you may, if you question a political philosophy, if you question a political policy, it becomes, well, then you must not be patriotic. You must. It becomes a hammer to smite your enemy with in a political forum, when initially it was genuine. I mean, those feelings that everybody felt initially were genuine sort of patriotic feelings. We're all in this together, we're going to do this together. And then that notion got to be used in a political sense. And now it's, I think, in many ways completely distorted.
Or if the other side identified an ideology that happened to have hijacked part of a faith belief, then they were labeled as anti-Islamic
exactly
or racist,
right. Yep.
or
Exactly
rather
right.
than actually dealing with the problem. I think one of the things we've been missing in the 10 years, and we saw this with all the wonderful congratulations that went to the SEAL team and everything that happened when we got bin Laden, a few weeks later realized, well, you know what? We're more at risk today than we've ever been. Homegrown terror is a problem now, and it wasn't a problem at 9/11. We're not safer than we were at 9/10/2011. And it's because we haven't had a vision. There's been no leadership, I think, in Washington that has identified a common vision. I think there's one theme in common with what's happening in the Arab Spring, what's happening with domestic radicalization. We try to compartmentalize countries and ideas, and there's one theme, which is lack of understanding of freedom and liberty in the Middle East and in Muslim-majority countries, a need for reform and modernization of Islamic theology and ideas. And these things have to be led with policymakers in Washington to say we need to pick sides within the House of Islam, and we haven't done that. We've just sort of been focused on partisanship and other things.
Bob, I want to go back to a point made earlier. I believe you made this point that the fear and the vulnerability leads to things. Are we still vulnerable? Do we still feel vulnerable? Do we feel safer? Do we feel stronger now than we did before 9/11?
No, but I'm not sure that we're not as safe or safer than we were on September 10th. We certainly perceive ourselves to be less safe. And I think we've gone on with our daily lives, but there's in the background a residual sense of larger vulnerability than we faced and felt prior to 9/11. So I think that is, it's something, I mean, for most of us, the effects of 9/11 are felt primarily when we go to an airport. Mm-hmm. But I believe in the background, there's that larger sense of vulnerability that is always with us.
But if you ask the families of Fort Hood massacre, the 13 that died, if you ask the people that found the Times Square bomber, the Christmas bomber, all the cells that have been unroofed, there have been over 220 arrests on terror charges in the past 14 to 18 months. So part of that fear is real. Our Homeland Security is doing a great job, but so far we've just had a whack-a-mole program, and there hasn't been actually a core treatment of what the real problem is, because we can't even talk about it.
Plus, there's a larger question, I think, which is, did the terrorists win? Did they win? If you look at it from an economic perspective, if what they wanted to do was sort of somehow cripple us in some way, you could look at the economic picture and say, since 9/11, we've abandoned so many interior needs of the country in order to serve this one purpose, which has, the trillions of dollars that went into the war efforts and other things like that. And then we have this enormous partisanship. We have a large division inside the country. I mean, there are things about what they did that really caused us, that have left us some very negative effects that I don't think we're like willing to deal with. I mean, I think that there are domestic issues, social issues that have been totally tabled with our notion, and any question about should we be spending, for instance, this much money in this country, in these countries with these wars right now, is just now becoming sort of bubbling to the top, and it has more to do with the recession than anything else.
I know you've talked. I think you've actually talked. We talked a little bit earlier before the show about this kind of idea where people, covert ideas, underlying things and reasons that people may not even be aware of, but when they say certain things and they think they are certain ways, not necessarily so. Talk to us about that.
Oh, okay. We were talking about a related kind of issue. I do a lot of research on stereotypes and prejudice, and I don't want to bring us too far astray of the present conversation, but I think one of the benefits of the surge in patriotism was, again, this sort of collective coping and this sense of shared humanity among Americans. One of the major downsides of that was that we saw a surge in prejudice against people of Middle Eastern descent, regardless of whether they had any reasonable, linking even to the Muslim religion. And of course, any Muslim American was then perceived as, extremist or, someone that could be a terrorist. And then anyone of Southeast Asian descent sort of gets lumped in there. So we see a surge in, well, we have this great sort of coming together as Americans. We have an almost inclusive, but one little aspect of this is missing in terms of that inclusive definition of what it is to be American. If you belong to or are perceived to belong to this specific ethnic group or this particular religious faith, then we don't want you. You are a member of the out-group. You are suddenly associated with the enemy. And so I think we see a surge in prejudice against those.
I would say as a Muslim, has been, I would agree, an increase in prejudice towards Muslims. But if you compare that to other minority groups, most studies that have been blinded and actually looked at reports per percent, where Muslims are 1.5% of the population compared to, let's say, discrimination against the Jewish community or others, it actually has been, I think, exaggerated in its reporting. There may have been an increase from what it was before 9/11, but still compared to other minority groups, it's, I think, in many ways, we have this penchant in America to keep blaming ourselves for everything, rather than, I think, looking at things proportionately, right?
And that's a good jumping off spot because we have a little bit of time here left, and I want each of you to respond to this one. Years from now, with the grandkids on your knees, and you're talking and they're talking, and they say, what was 9/11 really like? What was it all about? What will you tell them years from now?
It depends on, the story is not yet fully written, so it will depend upon whether there is a reconciliation between mosque and state in the Muslim world, whether there is forms of self-governance that are respectful of what we regard as human rights in the West, and whether the United States has become more of the peaceful trading nation that the founders intended. So I think that's what I will tell them about our reaction to 9/11 is that it was woefully uncalibrated, that we changed our government in ways that were only tangentially related to protecting us against the threat. We employed massive land forces in countries disproportionate to what that meant with respect to the threat. And the lesson I would impart upon them is that even when you are attacked, and even when you need to respond as an act of war, you need to keep your wits about you and calibrate your response to what the actual threat is and what is necessary to manage it.
Ed, grandkid on your knee, we all heard stories about Pearl Harbor. What do you tell them?
What I would hope would be that 9/11 is what I'm talking about. What I would hope is that there's nothing in those intervening years that causes us to supersede 9/11, and I would say that it brings out the best and worst of us, the same as happened with Pearl Harbor. With Pearl Harbor, it brought out the best in Americans and it brought out the worst in Americans. We did look at what we did to Japanese Americans and even other German Americans, Italian Americans. I would hope say that every time there's an issue like this, it's going to bring out the best and the worst.
What do you tell your grandkids? It's going to be a while from now,
yeah.
but what do you tell them?
Well, I'm working out now. I'm just kidding. I'm going to tell them, I think, I feel like the story is not completely finished, and so it's hard to say now, but I'm going to say that it's a day that changed a lot of Americans' way of thinking about what it meant to be American, how the world viewed Americans, and just sort of the frailty of life, the positive and the negative.
We've got about a minute left.
I would tell them that it was a tipping point for the United States and the West, and that we had an era before that was guided by a Cold War where we realized the enemy was not just the Soviet Union but an ideology of communism. And similarly, Al-Qaeda is simply one small organization out of Wahhabi radical Islam, and that we realized as a country, and I realized as a Muslim, that a change that I thought would happen over generations, I had to form an organization like the American Islamic Forum, form projects like the Muslim Liberty Project, because the changes that our founding fathers went through in the escape from Christian theocracy was the same process of enlightenment that Muslims need to go through, and the Arab Spring and other things could lead to a winter of Islamism unless we get involved through continued Muslim reform to modernity. And 9/11 was a tipping point to wake up the West to that.
All right. Great conversation. Thank you all for joining us tonight on Horizon. Good stuff. Tomorrow on Horizon, Arizona's Attorney General ups the ante in his investigation of the Independent Redistricting Commission, and benefits for same-sex partners of state workers gets the attention of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's Friday on Horizon's Journalists Roundtable. That is it for now. I'm Ted Simons. Thank you so much for joining us. You have a great evening.
Horizon is made possible by contributions from the Friends of Eight, members of your Arizona PBS station. Thank you.